The Soviet lunar lander, Luna 27, descended slowly through the thin veil of sunlight that illuminated the far side of the moon. The cabin rattled with the hum of retro thrusters firing sporadically to stabilize their descent. Through the thick glass of his helmet, Commander Viktor Ivanov watched as the alien landscape rose up to meet them, an expanse of desolation and shadow, punctuated by jagged craters and steep ridges. "This is uncharted territory," he reminded his team, his voice crackling through the comms. "Keep your wits about you." "Yes, Commander," came the responses, tense but resolute. The lander settled into a crater that had been selected based on weeks of orbital reconnaissance. Its designation, Chimera Crater, stemmed from strange readings that had baffled Soviet scientists for years. Localized magnetic disturbances had been detected here, an anomaly on a celestial body lacking a magnetosphere. It defied explanation. As the vibrations from the landing subsided, Dr. Elena Karpova, the team's biologist, leaned toward a small viewport. Her breath fogged the glass as she gazed at the alien terrain. The walls of the crater shimmered faintly, reflecting light in a way that seemed almost alive. "Do you see that?" she murmured. "It's like the surface is breathing." "It's just lunar regolith catching the light," said engineer Pavel Volkov, although his tone carried more doubt than reassurance. After a final check of their EVA suits, the team exited the lander. Dust rose in slow, graceful arcs around their boots. Sergei Trofimov, the radio operator, carried a portable communications relay. As he set it up, faint static began to hiss through their headsets. "Odd interference," Sergei said. "I'll adjust the signal gain." "No," said Victor. "Keep it as it is. Record everything." The descent into the crater was arduous. The incline was steep, and the loose regolith threatened to send them tumbling with every step. The lower they went, the stranger the terrain became. The shimmering surface they'd seen from above was composed of smooth, glass-like structures, each resembling elongated hexagonal prisms. "These aren't natural formations," Elena whispered, brushing her gloved hand over one of the structures. "They're too uniform." She paused, staring at a fracture in the glass. Something was embedded within. An organic mass, dark and fibrous, as though fossilized. "Commander, I need a sample," Elena said, reaching for her tools. "Be quick," Victor replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. The crater's shadows seemed deeper now, almost oppressive. He felt an irrational unease, like the place was watching them. Elena extracted a fragment of the glassy material, revealing more of the organic substance inside. It shimmered faintly in the light of her helmet. "Biologically impossible," she muttered. "It looks alive." As they pressed further into the crater, Pavel spotted an opening in the ground, a yawning chasm that led into darkness. A faint pulsation emanated from the entrance, rhythmic like a heartbeat. "Do we proceed?" Pavel asked, his voice tight. "Of course," Victor said. "This is why we're here." The group activated their helmet lights and began their descent into the subterranean passage. The walls of the tunnel were composed of the same glass-like material, now etched with strange patterns, grooves that formed spiraling, almost hypnotic designs. When they reached the first chamber, they froze. Before them lay rows of massive, skeletal remains, embedded in the walls like specimens in an ancient display. Each skeleton was grotesquely alien. Elongated skulls with jagged predator-like jaws, rib cages flaring outward as if to accommodate massive organs. Their limbs ended in cruel, hooked claws. "These things are predators," Elena said, her voice trembling. "But they're long dead." "Fossils." Sergei moved closer to one of the skeletons, his flashlight catching something behind it. "There's another chamber." The team squeezed through a narrow crevice into the second chamber. This one was vastly different. The walls pulsed faintly with light, and the floor was covered in a thick, viscous substance. At the center of the chamber stood an enormous pod-like structure. It was unlike anything they'd seen, organic in appearance, yet with a metallic sheen. Its surface rippled, almost as if it were breathing. "It's alive," Elena whispered, taking an involuntary step back. "No, it's dormant," Victor corrected, though the doubt in his voice was palpable. As Sergei adjusted his radio pack, the static grew louder. It began to shift, forming patterns, then words, faint, indecipherable whispers. "Commander," Sergei said, his face pale, "something is interfering with the signal. It's like it's trying to speak." "Cut the relay," Victor barked, but Sergei froze. I can't. It's inside the system." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the very walls of the chamber were vibrating with sound. Pavel dropped his toolkit, his breathing rapid. "This isn't right. We need to leave. Now." Before Victor could respond, a low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber. The pod began to shift, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. A thin crack appeared along its side, oozing the viscous substance that coated the floor. "Retreat!" Victor shouted, his voice barely masking his panic. But it was too late. The pod burst open, and from its depths emerged a grotesque entity, amalgamated flesh and sinew, its form constantly shifting as if it hadn't yet decided what it wanted to become. It had too many limbs, each ending in razor-sharp tips, and its eyeless face opened into a maw of spiraling, needle-like teeth. As the team scrambled back toward the surface, the whispers turned to screams. The chamber was chaos. Victor's voice cut through the rising panic, his orders sharp and unyielding. "Move! Back to the surface, now!" The team scrambled toward the tunnel they had come from, their boots slipping on the viscous floor. The alien creature writhed in the center of the chamber, its form jerking violently as if testing the limits of its newly awakened body. Its movements were wet and unsettling, accompanied by a sound like tearing flesh. Dr. Elena Karpova, lagging behind the others, couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature. "It's adapting," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. The thing was shifting, growing elongated limbs, a sinewy torso, and appendages tipped with jagged hooks. It moved with terrifying speed, skittering across the walls and ceiling of the chamber. "Elena, go!" Victor shouted, pulling her out of her trance. She turned and ran, her breath loud in her helmet, as the creature let out a guttural, reverberating sound that seemed to shake the walls. As they ascended the tunnel, Sergei Trofimov's equipment began to malfunction. His comms pack, still crackling with alien whispers, emitted a high-pitched shriek. He ripped it off, throwing it aside, but the noise didn't stop. "It's in the systems," Sergei cried. "The signal, it's everywhere." A moment later, the creature burst into the tunnel behind them, its amorphous form squeezing through the narrow passage with horrifying ease. Its limbs lashed out, catching Sergei by the leg. His scream echoed in the team's headsets as the creature dragged him back toward the chamber. "No!" Victor shouted, turning to help, but Pavel grabbed his arm. "We can't save him," Pavel yelled. "If we stop now, we all die." Sergei's screams abruptly cut off, replaced by the wet, tearing sounds of flesh. Victor's hands trembled, but he knew Pavel was right. With a heavy heart, he pushed forward, urging the team to keep climbing. When they finally emerged from the tunnel into the crater, the landscape had changed. The shimmering glass structures now pulsed faintly with light, as if reacting to the creature's awakening. "Back to the lander," Victor ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. They sprinted toward the spacecraft, but as they neared, Elena stopped abruptly, pointing. "Look." The lander's hull was covered in the same viscous substance they had encountered in the chamber. It had begun to harden, forming web-like patterns that spread across the exterior. "It's infected," Pavel said, his voice low with dread. "We can still launch," Victor insisted, though he knew it was a gamble. "We'll clear the contamination once we're back in orbit." But before they could reach the hatch, the creature burst from the tunnel behind them, now fully formed. Its body was an amalgamation of sinew and exoskeleton, its limbs ending in talons that gleamed under the faint light of the sun. Its eyeless face turned toward them, and for a moment it simply stood there, as if studying them. Then it charged. The team scattered, firing their handheld drills and improvised tools in a futile attempt to slow the creature. Victor grabbed a plasma torch from Pavel's pack and activated it, slashing at the beast as it lunged toward Elena. The torch seared through its flesh, causing it to screech and recoil, but the wound healed almost instantly. "It regenerates," Elena shouted, backing away. The creature's form began to shift again, its limbs elongating into whip-like tendrils that lashed out with deadly precision. One of them struck Pavel, piercing his abdomen. He gasped, blood spraying into the low gravity around him. Victor and Elena pulled him back, but it was clear he wouldn't survive the wound. "Leave me," Pavel wheezed, clutching at Victor's arm. "Get out of here. Blow the damn thing to hell." Victor hesitated for only a moment before nodding grimly. "You'll be remembered." As Pavel fell to his knees, torch in hand, Victor and Elena ran for the lander. Pavel turned the torch on the creature, igniting the volatile substances it had left behind. The explosion rocked the crater, sending dust and debris flying in every direction. Inside the lander, Victor and Elena scrambled to launch. The controls flickered erratically, the systems struggling against the alien interference. Elena frantically bypassed the infected circuits, her hands shaking as she worked. "Come on," she muttered. "Come on." Finally, the engines roared to life and the lander lifted off, leaving the creature behind. Victor collapsed into his seat, his chest heaving with relief. But their reprieve was short-lived. As they reached orbit, alarms blared. The contamination had spread into the lander's life support systems. The viscous substance was seeping into the controls, pulsating with a malevolent rhythm. "It's evolving," Elena said, her voice hollow. "It's trying to take over the ship." "Can we stop it?" Victor asked, though he already knew the answer. Elena shook her head. "Not without destroying the entire module." Victor stared out the window at the black expanse of space. The Earth hung in the distance, a beautiful blue orb that now felt impossibly far away. He clenched his fists. "We can't let this thing reach Earth." Elena nodded, her expression resolute. "We have to warn them. And then, we end this." As the lander's systems began to fail, Victor sent out a final transmission to Earth, detailing the events on the moon and the nature of the creature. He included instructions for immediate quarantine and destruction of any returning craft. As the last of their oxygen depleted, Victor and Elena shared a look of quiet understanding. There was no escape for them, but perhaps, through their sacrifice, humanity could be spared. The transmission cut off, leaving the lander silent as it drifted toward its doomed orbit. And below, on the far side of the moon, the creature began to stir again. In a dimly lit operations room at Area 51, the air was thick with tension. The crackling transmission from Luna 27 filled the space, fragmented by interference and laced with a strange, faint undertone that sounded almost like whispers. CIA operative Catherine Hayes stood at the center of the room, her sharp eyes fixed on the playback. "Repeat the last segment," she ordered. The technician rewound the tape and played it again. Viktor Ivanov's voice was strained but urgent. "This is Luna 27. We have encountered a biological entity on the moon's far side. It is hostile, adaptive, and regenerates. Our ship is compromised. Do not, repeat, do not allow any contamination to reach Earth. Immediate quarantine protocols are required. This transmission contains all data and visuals. End transmission." The message ended abruptly, replaced by static. Catherine turned to Dr. Malcolm Drake, the lead exobiologist at the facility, who was seated beside her, furiously taking notes. "Thoughts?" she asked. Dr. Drake adjusted his glasses, his face pale. "If what they're describing is accurate, this isn't just an extraterrestrial organism, it's an apex predator. And if it's adaptive and regenerative..." He trailed off, his expression darkening. Catherine folded her arms. "Finish your thought." Dr. Drake hesitated before speaking. "If even a fragment of it reaches Earth, containment will be impossible." The two were escorted to a high-security lab buried deep beneath the facility. Inside, rows of containment units housed artifacts and biological samples from years of clandestine research. At the far end of the room, a reinforced glass enclosure contained what appeared to be the skeletal remains of an alien creature. "This was recovered from the Roswell crash site," Dr. Drake said, gesturing to the enclosure. "We've studied it for decades. It's long dead, but some of its biological structures are eerily similar to what the Soviets described in their transmission." Catherine stepped closer, examining the grotesque remains. The skeleton was elongated, with jagged blade-like limbs and a massive rib cage that flared outward. "You're saying we've seen something like this before?" "Yes," Dr. Drake replied, "but we never fully understood its capabilities. These organisms appear to operate on a level of biological sophistication that we can barely comprehend. They're not just alive, they're engineered to survive. Catherine narrowed her eyes. And you didn't think to warn anyone? Dr. Drake sighed. We thought it was extinct. Clearly, we were wrong. Meanwhile, analysts worked tirelessly to decode the full data packet sent by Luna 27. What they uncovered was horrifying. Grainy video footage showed the alien creature in its various forms, shifting and adapting as it slaughtered the Soviet crew. Still, images revealed the glass-like structures in Chimera Crater, pulsating with light, and the grotesque skeletal remains embedded in the walls of the alien structure. "What's this?" one of the analysts asked, pointing to a waveform in the data file. "It's an audio signal," another replied. "Low frequency, almost imperceptible. It matches the interference we've been picking up since the transmission started." Catherine and Dr. Drake rushed to the analyst's station. "Are you saying the signal is part of the organism?" Catherine asked. Dr. Drake studied the waveform, his expression growing grim. "It's possible. If the organism can emit electromagnetic signals, it could be trying to communicate, or worse, infect systems remotely." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. In a secure conference call with Soviet officials, Catherine demanded answers. "You sent a crew to the far side of the moon without informing anyone. Now, you've unleashed a biological weapon that could wipe out humanity. What the hell were you thinking?" The Soviet representative, General Dmitry Volkov, bristled. "We did not know what we would find. The anomaly warranted investigation, and let us not forget, Area 51 has its own secrets." "This isn't a Cold War pissing contest," Catherine snapped. "Your people woke up something that should have stayed buried. We need your complete cooperation to contain this." After a tense silence, General Volkov relented. "You will have access to all our data. But know this, if this creature reaches Earth, it will not discriminate between Americans and Soviets." Hours later, Area 51 received a distressing update. The Luna 27 lander was still in orbit around the moon, but its trajectory had shifted. The lander, now fully compromised by the organism, was on a slow but steady path back to Earth. "Can we intercept it?" Catherine asked. Dr. Drake shook his head. "Not with conventional methods. If the contamination has spread throughout the lander, even destroying it could release microscopic spores into the atmosphere." Catherine leaned against the table, her mind racing. "What about nuking it in space?" Dr. Drake hesitated. "It's a gamble. If any spores survive the explosion, they'll drift into Earth's orbit." "We don't have a choice," Catherine said firmly. "Get me the Pentagon." As preparations for the orbital strike were underway, something chilling happened. The low-frequency signal from the alien organism grew stronger, disrupting communications worldwide. Power grids began to flicker, satellites malfunctioned, and unexplained outages plagued major cities. "It's reaching out," Dr. Drake said, his voice shaking. "The signal is broadcasting from the lander and amplifying. It could be calling for reinforcements, or worse, spreading its influence." Catherine clenched her fists. "We need to end this, now." The Pentagon authorized a nuclear strike on the compromised lander. A missile was launched from a classified space platform, its trajectory locked on to the infected vessel. The control room at Area 51 watched in tense silence as the missile approached its target. Impact in 3, 2, 1, the technician announced. The screen lit up with the bright flash of the explosion. The lander disintegrated, its debris scattering into the void. For a moment there was relief. But then the analyst monitoring the signal froze. "Ma'am, the signal, it's still active." Dr. Drake's face went pale. It must have already spread. The spores, they're drifting toward Earth. Catherine's blood ran cold. God help us. As the first spores entered Earth's atmosphere, microscopic particles unseen to the naked eye began settling across the planet. Somewhere in a remote forest, a single droplet of the viscous substance fell onto the leaf of a tree. The leaf began to ripple unnaturally. The infected fragments of Luna 27 descended silently into Earth's atmosphere, unnoticed by most of the world. Scientists at Area 51 scrambled to track the spread, their instruments lighting up with data points scattered across continents. The spores were too small, too numerous. They had failed to destroy the threat. In the command center, Catherine Hayes gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white. How long do we have before it manifests? Dr. Malcolm Drake stared at the screens, his face ashen. It's impossible to predict. It could take hours, days, or it might already be here. The room fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the frantic typing of technicians. Outside the bunker, the world carried on, oblivious to the creeping horror that had just begun to take root. In a quiet rural town in Kansas, a farmer named Tom Harper noticed something strange in his cornfield. The plants were covered in a translucent film glistening under the morning sun. As he brushed a leaf, the substance clung to his fingers, tingling like static electricity. By nightfall, he was feverish, his skin blistering with patches of gray, fibrous growth. He was the first. By the next day, local hospitals were overwhelmed. Patients arrived with unexplainable symptoms, mutating bodies, limbs elongating or splitting apart, eyes clouding over with a milky sheen. Reports flooded in from other parts of the world. In a remote village in Siberia, a young girl was found with her torso fused to the wall of her home, her mouth frozen mid-scream. In Tokyo, subway passengers panicked as a man collapsed, his skin erupting into spiked tendrils that lashed out like living whips. The alien spores were no longer dormant. At Area 51, Catherine sat in the debriefing room, her head in her hands. "We should have acted sooner," she muttered. "We should have destroyed the lander before it ever reached orbit." Dr. Drake sat across from her, his glasses askew and his eyes hollow. "We didn't know. None of us could have predicted this." Catherine looked up, her eyes blazing. "That's a lie, Malcolm. You knew. You suspected this organism wasn't just a parasite. It's an apex predator. It's designed to consume, to evolve, to dominate." Drake didn't respond. He didn't need to. She was right. A junior technician burst into the room, his face pale. "Ma'am, you need to see this." In the control room, they watched as satellite feeds displayed cities falling into chaos. In London, grotesque creatures, partially human and partially alien, stalked the streets, their bodies twisting and writhing as they hunted survivors. In New York, bioorganic growths spread across skyscrapers like a fungal network, pulsating with malevolent energy. The spores weren't just killing, they were transforming the world into something unrecognizable. A sudden alert interrupted the chaos. A transmission had been detected, one originating from Luna 27's doomed lander before its destruction. Technicians rushed to decode the garbled message, and as it played, Catherine and Drake froze. "This is Commander Viktor Ivanov of Luna 27, the voice crackled. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "To anyone who receives this, we failed. The organism, it is not just alive, it is a hive, a single entity. It will not stop. It will consume all life until nothing remains but itself." The message cut out, leaving a heavy silence in the room. "What do we do?" someone whispered. Catherine straightened, her voice cold and resolute. "We end it. If we can't stop it on the ground, we destroy everything it can touch." A desperate plan took shape. Catherine proposed using Area 51's most closely guarded asset, a stockpile of kinetic orbital weapons, massive tungsten rods capable of generating city-leveling force on impact. It was a scorched earth approach. The weapons would be deployed across the planet, targeting areas with the highest concentrations of infection. Billions would die, but it was the only way to ensure the organism couldn't spread further. The room erupted into arguments. General Volkov, now part of the Joint Task Force, slammed his fist on the table. "You're talking about annihilating half the planet." Catherine met his gaze with steely determination. "And if we don't, the organism will do it for us, only it won't stop at half. It will take everything." Dr. Drake, trembling, finally spoke. "If we do this, humanity may not recover. We'll be killing more than just people, ecosystems, history, civilization itself." Catherine's voice softened, though her resolve did not waver. "There won't be a civilization if we let it continue." The launch sequence began. Across the globe, satellites adjusted their trajectories, targeting the infected zones. Catherine stood in the command center, her hand hovering over the activation panel. "Are you sure about this?" Drake asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," she replied, her eyes locked on the screen. "But it's not about being sure. It's about doing what has to be done." She pressed the button. High above the earth, the tungsten rods were released. They streaked through the atmosphere like falling stars, their impact shattering cities and vaporizing entire regions. The earth shook with the force of the strikes, and plumes of fire and smoke rose into the sky. In the aftermath, silence fell. The infected zones were obliterated, reduced to smoldering craters. But so were uninfected regions, innocent lives lost in the billions. The world was left scarred, a wasteland of ash and ruin. Catherine stepped outside the bunker for the first time in days. The air was thick with smoke, the sky a sickly gray. The distant horizon was lined with the silhouettes of bioorganic growths, still pulsating, though weaker now. They hadn't eradicated it completely. They had only delayed the inevitable. Dr. Drake joined her, his face gaunt. "Was it worth it?" Catherine didn't answer. She stared at the horizon, her chest heavy with the weight of her choice. She had saved what little of humanity remained, but at what cost? As they stood in silence, a faint whisper carried on the wind. Catherine stiffened. She turned to Drake, her eyes wide with realization. "It's still alive," she whispered. In the distance, the bioorganic growths began to move.